Today, on Ascend the Great Books podcast, we were joined by two scholars from the Alcuin Institute for Catholic Culture for the Diocese of Tulsa, and I read my article that I wrote for them in full, Avoiding the Unreal, How to Read the Great Books Well. We had a wonderful follow-up discussion talking about how do we come to love the great books, where did things go wrong in great books. There's the ancients, there's the moderns, are they all good, are they all bad? We gave some recommendations, a little bit of C.S. Lewis, a little bit of Pope Benedict XVI on how to map modernity and what's that look like. We gave some practical recommendations of how to actually avoid what's unreal, go out, touch grass, right? What's real, what's not. And we even learned about Blessed Alcuin of York. So join us as we pursue what is true, good, and beautiful together.
We are here today with two great men from the Alcuin Institute of Catholic Culture here in the Diocese of Tulsa, the president, Dr. Richard Meloche, fellow tutor, Dr. Aaron Henderson. Welcome. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us this evening.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, thanks.
It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to read, like we said, Deacon's article on Avoiding the Unreal, How to Read the Great Books Well, as we're about to enter into the year of Homer, going through everything. I thought this would be a good launching point.
Yeah, very good. All right, so Avoiding the Unreal, How to Read the Great Books Well.
Which you can find on the alcuininstitute.org.
Very good, yes. Reclaim your education. We are concerned as anybody else at the headlong plunge into the abyss that Western civilization seems to be taking, wrote Robert M. Hutchins, editor of the 1952 Great Books of the Western World. In order to recall the West to sanity, Hutchins and his associate editor, Mortimer Adler, compiled the 54-volume Great Books of the Western World series, representing the primary texts from the greatest intellects in Western history. From Homer to Dante to Shakespeare, they saw these authors in dialogue, a, quote, great conversation that gave the West a distinctive character. These authors, especially the ancient and medieval ones, had contributed to the rise of liberal arts and to the belief that the liberally educated man was one who had disciplined his passions in pursuit of the good. As Hutchins observed, the aim of liberal education is human excellence. Yet Hutchins saw the West as undergoing a practical book burning. The great books were being removed from Western education, and with them any semblance of a true liberal education. Today, the book burning continues. It is evident that modern education is more a training. It trains students for a societal function and delegates the holistic human formation to a culture of relativism. A college graduate is no longer expected to be acquainted with the masterpieces of his tradition, nor the perennial questions into truth, beauty, or goodness. We are deaf to the great conversation. We are cut off from the great treasury of our intellectual inheritance and only vaguely aware it even exists. The great books are an invitation to reclaim your education. They are a remedy to the privations of modern education and a salvageable substitute for our lack of a robust liberal arts formation. As Hutchins advocated in reading the authors of the great books, we are still in the ordinary world, but it is an ordinary world transfigured and seen through the eyes of wisdom and genius. We are invited to the great conversation to listen, to add our voice to the pursuit of truth. There is a latent danger, however, in how one approaches the great books. Part 2, avoid the sins of your age. In his 1647 masterpiece, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, the Spanish priest Balthazar Gracian exhorted his audience to avoid the faults of your nation. He explained, water shares the good or bad qualities of the strata through which it flows, and man those of the climate in which he is born. We live, as Cardinal Ratzinger observes, under a dictatorship of relativism, and it contaminates every feature of our intellect. To have the requisite self-awareness and virtue to purge these impurities is a triumph of cleverness. Whether we think of the Ark of Noah, the compulsion out of Plato's cave, or the angel that led Lot out of Sodom, the great books can help us escape the errors of our age. Writers like Aristotle or St. Boethius challenge our modern presumptions and stretch our imagination to encompass new perspectives on reality. We may better see our age for what it is and what led to our present culture or anti-culture. Relativism, however, is pernicious and infects even the remedies against it. We should observe that the authors of the great books disagree. In fact, many of the modern great books became great by being contrary to most all that had preceded them. The political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes is a rejection of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. The understanding of history by Karl Marx is a revolution against almost 2,000 years of human observation, and Friedrich Nietzsche rejects everyone to wage war against Socrates and Jesus Christ. In short, the great books were chosen for their impact and not principally for their truth. The latent danger in the great books is that one simply becomes a well-read relativist. Before us are the greatest minds in the West, and these minds disagree. Therefore, there is no reasonable expectation of truth. Even so-called conservative great book projects will refrain from saying one great book is better than another. They denounce any type of guidance to the great books, favoring a pseudo-neutrality that places dialogue over truth. As Patrick Deneen observes in his 2013 essay, Against Great Books, I have come to suspect that the very source of the decline of the study of the great books comes not in spite of the lessons of the great books, but is to be found in the very arguments within a number of the great books. Many of the great books listed in the great books of the Western world are the same books that led to the crisis of education in the West. As Deneen notes, the broader assault on the liberal arts derives much of its intellectual fuel from a number of the great books themselves. If applied incorrectly, the remedy for our failing liberal education, the great books, becomes part of the disease. The great books can help us avoid the errors of our age, but we cannot approach them through those same errors. Approaching the great books as some cosmopolitan relativist bears a contrary purpose than that of the traditional liberal arts. If the great books are our answer to the collapse of the liberal arts, then the great books must echo the true purpose of the liberal arts. Part 3. Conform your mind to reality. In his 1946 classic, The Intellectual Life, the French Dominican A.G. Sartiange lays out the simple purpose of study. The order of the mind must correspond to the order of things. He is drawing from St. Thomas Aquinas, who teaches that truth is the conformity of the mind to reality. This is the purpose of the liberal arts, of the great books, and of all study, the pursuit of truth. We must labor to conform our minds to the contours of reality. We aid one another in our pursuit of truth through our words, whether oral or written, for it is the purpose of our words to convey truth. How rich we are, then, to have the writings of such masters as St. Augustine to help guide us in this vocation of the intellect. As Sartiange teaches, books are the signposts on the movement of the mind toward truth. We approach such authors as a student approaches a teacher, ready for a tutelage in what is real. All things are judged good or bad according to their purpose, or telos, as the classical Greeks called it. I know a good knife must be sharp because I understand its purpose is to cut. And because I know its purpose, I understand that the whetstone is good for the knife, while its opposite would be bad. In sum, because I understand the purpose or telos of a thing, I can know whether the quality of that thing is good or bad, and also what is good or bad for that thing. So, too, is it for our intellect. If the purpose of our intellect is truth, then it is by that standard I judge what is good or bad for my intellect. Like a whetstone to the knife, a true great book will sharpen the mind's understanding of reality. It is in obedience to this telos that we, like Sartiange, judge our study in the study of the great books in particular. Not all great books meet the standard, as some are guides to the delineations of what is real, while others labor against it. If we are to reclaim what was lost when the liberal arts fell, then the purpose of studying the great books must be the pursuit of truth. It was not relativistic dialogue that led Blessed Alcuin of York and Emperor Charlemagne to rebuild the West, nor was it relativism that nurtured St. Thomas Aquinas or Dante. We are the inheritors of a robust pursuit of truth, a desire to satiate in the thickness of reality. Yet how does one judge what is true? In other words, how do we reconcile that we turn to the great books to teach us truth, yet we are to judge the great books by whether they teach truth? Are we the arbiter of what is real? What standards or principles should one bring to the study of the great books? What was the principle of truth amongst the liberal arts? Part 4, become a student of the Logos. In his architectonic 2006 lecture at the University of Regensburg, Pope Benedict XVI proclaimed not to act in accordance with reason is contrary to God's nature. His address, arguably one of the most important post-conciliar papal teachings, submits that there is a profound harmony between Greek reason and Hebrew faith. The Greek philosophers, like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, sought the logos of reality. The Greek term logos meant the account of something or the ordering principle of a thing. In Plato's Republic, for example, Socrates is seeking the logos of justice, to know the reason and reality of what justice is. Aristotle speaks of logos as an argument that appeals to the intellect. The pursuit of the logos is part of our intellectual inheritance. It cultivated in the West the belief that nature, and all within it, bears a discoverable rational order. It is at the heart of both our philosophy and our empirical sciences, as from the logos we draw the word logic and the suffix -logy, as in biology, the account of life, or zoology, the account of animals. If truth, as aforementioned, is the conformity of the mind to reality, it was the concept of logos that taught the West that reality was an ordered, objective, and rational whole. Greek reason and Hebrew faith began a dialogue hundreds of years prior to Christ. As Pope Benedict observes, despite the bitter conflict with those Hellenistic rulers who sought to accommodate it forcibly to the customs and idolatrous cult of the Greeks, biblical faith in the Hellenistic period encountered the best of Greek thought at a deep level, resulting in a mutual enrichment, evident especially in the later wisdom literature. To the Holy Father's point, one may compare the violent clash of the Greeks and Hebrews in 1st and 2nd Maccabees with the notable influence of Greek thought upon the reflections on the faith in the Book of Wisdom or Sirach. Moreover, it is notable that the first Old Testament canon, the Septuagint, was a Greek translation centered in Alexandria. In sum, Greek reason, coupled with Hebrew faith, under Roman order, tilled the earth for the coming of Jesus Christ. As St. Paul teaches, our Lord came in the fullness of time. The zenith of this harmony is provided by St. John, as he opens his gospel with an allusion to Genesis. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. St. John notably gives the second person of the Blessed Trinity the name Logos. He further proclaims the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, is the Logos of all creation, the ordering principle of reality itself. As Aristotle notes that Logos can be a communication of reason, so too is the Logos the Word spoken by the Father in Genesis, that structured the very order of being. The rational order of reality observed by the Greeks is the work of the eternal Word, the Logos. As St. Paul teaches in Jesus Christ, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created through him and for him. Note as well that the Logos not only created reality, but continues to hold it in existence. What the Greeks sought via reason and what the Hebrews sought via faith is revealed to be Jesus Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, the eternal Logos. Truth is the conformity of the mind to reality, because objects in reality have a logos, a rational order, to which the mind may adhere. Here we may better understand why Christ proclaims he is the truth. If Jesus is the logos of all that is real, reason itself, the account of all creation, then to conform your mind to him would be to contemplate the truth of all things. He is not the logos of any particular thing, but the logos of all. And in him and through him we may come to a better understanding of particulars. The liberal arts must be understood as a pursuit of the logos. The student would undergo a disciplined order of knowledge that moved the intellect into conformity with reality. First, the student would learn grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium, and then arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the quadrivium. All of these, however, in such higher sciences as medicine or law, were subservient to and perfected by the queen of the sciences, theology. The liberal arts were a foundation to and an acknowledgement of the study of God by both reason and faith, as illuminated by the Logos. It is amongst the debris of what was such a time-tested tutelage in the real that we must return to the great books. Deprived of this education, we must return first to the teachers, who may be called the ancients, the intellects from Homer to Dante, who built up such a rich treasury of education. It is by their observations on nature and revelation that we learn of the Logos. We live in the age of the anti-Logos. Modernity is a rejection. The second half of the great books, the moderns from Machiavelli to present, largely represents a deconstruction of any belief in an ordered whole of creation. While there are certainly good modern thinkers, such as Cardinal Newman or Pope Benedict XVI, the main trait of our modern age is a rejection. Man no longer turns to God, revelation, nature, or history for guidance, but rather those become malleable to man's creative will. Each man becomes his own God, his own logos, who believes reality should conform to the truth of his own imagination. We live in an anti-culture, our dominative tutelage in the unreal. We live in a post-Christian paganism that no longer even adheres to the natural logos of Socrates or Aristotle. The sin of our age, as Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI noted, is the sin against the Creator. Man now makes his own reality and demands others adhere to it, the dictatorship of relativism. Let us reclaim our culture. Let us reclaim our education by turning to the teachers of what is real, those who may help us in this age of the unreal, to conform our minds to reason itself, the eternal Logos, Jesus Christ.
Initial thoughts, Dr. Henderson?
Look, I think this is a perfect document, unparalleled. It should be numbered among the great books.
That's it. We're done. Thanks for coming to the podcast.
Thanks for watching.
Ryan. Yeah, that was good.
No, really good. I appreciate it. So perhaps my first thought is just maybe what I like about this article is that it situates us and is very stark and very honest about our historical situation. That we're the inheritors of this great tradition, and yet either we don't know that this tradition exists, which you said, which is pretty striking, or we've eschewed it, right? We've pushed it away, and we don't want anything to do with it. It's like the person who inherits a great jewel from a grandfather or grandmother or something, and has no, it's not his taste, and so he just kind of casts it aside and doesn't treasure this valuable family heirloom. I mean, there's something deeply perverse about that. So that's the first thing that sticks out to me, is just that it, I think, accurately sets up where we are and what is deeply wrong about where we are.
Yeah. Richard, do you have any hot takes, raw thoughts?
You are a man of hot takes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it's ironic, first off, that we're sitting around this table discussing the importance of the great books and the recovery of this wisdom, this Logos tradition. And I don't know if any of us have been really formed formally in the great books. I don't know if that's true or not, but none of us, I don't think, went through a great books program. None of us went to Thomas Aquinas College, or none of us had a classical education even, I don't think. I
Right.
could be wrong. But nonetheless, we're I think, to Aaron's point, that there's an awareness of the impoverishment of our education and the need to rectify that by turning somewhere, in this case to the great books, to become familiar with that glorious tradition that has been almost totally eclipsed. So there's an irony here as well. And I think, we represent many out there who are desiring that wisdom and don't know where to turn. So I think this is very important that we have this document before us, that we can maybe turn to it to help us recover what has been lost.
I think this is part. It's interesting, irony, right? Because that's actually part of the irony of education in general, right? Is I only present myself to be educated if I realize that I need to be educated, which requires education. And so maybe by way of introduction, you're correct. Like, I didn't go to a classical school. I didn't go to a 4-year liberal arts school like, Thomas Aquinas College, or, we could point to St. John's as well. So where did this come from for me? And I think for me, the study of the great books is intimately tied for me to also becoming Catholic, right? So I'm a convert. I went to Ave Maria University for my master's, which we should probably mention that you received your PhD from Ave Maria University, and you also received your PhD from Ave Maria University. So for me, when I was there, and maybe we can compare notes a little bit here. Well, I went there as a Protestant. I went there, I became interested in the Catholic faith going to Oral Roberts undergrad, which is a world away, right? Like, wait, how did that happen? So, I grew up in this, Protestant, Methodist, charismatic amalgamation household. Went to Oral Roberts, became interested in the faith basically through the relationship between faith and reason, right? I actually remember where I was sitting and what classroom I was when we were comparing, because how systematic theology was done is you would just be like, okay, baptism, and then you read 30 quotes about what baptism is, and then you pick which quote you like by which theologian, and then you move on, right? That's basically, it's basically like cafeteria Christianity just sunk down into its bones, right? Even to its study. So for whatever reason, they typically didn't. They actually had the Catholic quote. They usually didn't include one, but we were discussing the relationship between faith and reason. And then for whatever reason, the quote they had was the opening of Pope John Paul II's Fiat Ratio, right? That faith and reason are the two wings upon which the human spirit, right, rises to God, right? And for me, that was the first time in my life I'd ever heard that faith and reason could be harmonious. First time. That's why it stuck with me so much, because coming from the charismatic side, right, faith had to trump the intellect. And then that was also the time period that like the militant atheists were really popular, right? And so it was like, no, you just think this empirical knowledge is the only thing that's true. No one had told me that faith and reason could be in harmony. So I ended up I barely knew any Catholics. I basically just Googled Catholic universities when I was like, oh, where could I go to grad school, right? And so ended up at Ave Maria through God's providence and the lots of patience of Father Matthew Lamb, right? Who I think took pity on me, but thank God he did. And so they allowed me into the program. And part of the program at Ave Maria, when I went through it, it was a 64-hour, 2-year master's when I was there. And they had your typical systematic theology masters, which for Ave was basically reading the Summa for every course and then some, tangential secondary sources, which for me was wonderful. I mean, I just ate that up, right? I mean, that was just exactly what my soul needed. But then what really threw me for a loop, because I was very unfamiliar, it was completely alien to me, was, tracking alongside this systematic theology program was then this great book sequencing. And so thanks be to God, I showed up the year that they were starting the Ancients. And so for a whole year, alongside our master's work in theology, we read, these great texts of the Ancients. We started there. We didn't start with Homer. We started with Plato and read, Plato all the way up to Dante. And these, at a very quick pace, as grad school typically is, but in this big seminar room with the master students, with the PhD students. I was just sitting there hoping I didn't get called on. Like, it was very foreign to all of me, but I was very much soaking it all in. But this kind of beauty of understanding the great books, of seeing not just like theology isolated from the general culture and history, but seeing like how, in my opinion, providence has moved, right, the human intellect through time, that as I mentioned in the article, right, originally preparing the world to receive the incarnation of Christ, and then how then the world receiving the incarnation gave this reflective growth and flourishing throughout the ages. And then really, then the next year when we went to the moderns, it was just became so clear that when you start reading people like Luther or Machiavelli or Hobbes and Locke, et cetera, that they're only becoming famous on a rejection. Like they're just rejecting part of the cosmic whole. And a lot of things even that we attribute to the moderns are really already in the ancients. They're just highlighted differently or torn apart or, disproportionate. And so that, for me, going through that program really was formative to me on a deep level. And halfway through that program, I entered into the Catholic Church. Thanks be to God, at the little oratory down there. So when you guys were both going through that, did they have that great books sequencing when you went through?
Well, it wasn't a great. They didn't call it a great book sequencing, but we had a series of colloquia that were focused on the ancients and modern. So I think that's precisely what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But they didn't present it as great books. It was just kind of, we read all these texts, like you said, from Plato to Dante, and then up through the moderns and Rousseau, and the whole 9 yards. But yes, that was very much formal and very important to the program. And so they still have that.
And uniquely, it was conversational.
Yes.
Right, you were to enter into dialogue with the authors of these texts, and also in dialogue with one another. Right, it was very conversational in that sense.
But I will note, and this is very relevant for this reading, it wasn't an uncritical look. That is to say, at Ave, they didn't just throw these books in front of us and just assume that all of them were on equal footing. No, they give us some hermeneutics, some hermeneutical tools of interpretation, whereby we could read these texts and say, okay, what is true, what is false, right? In light of what the church teaches, in light of what we already know through human reason. And so very much to your point, it was not an uncritical, but one formed by the church's great tradition.
And not only that too, but also Father Matt Lamb, I think, as a good pedagogue, as a master teacher, was very systematic in including what texts are in this canon that we're reading as a grad student.
That's a good point.
And what is the order in which we are reading these texts?
Yeah.
And again, I think you pointed this out in your article, Deacon, is that there's a danger of the great books in general if you just have a smorgasbord kind of approach to the texts and just read them without an intentional ordering of the texts.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I didn't realize when I was there, and as you mentioned, they don't just talk about it just as a flat great books program. No. It was this kind of the dialogue of the ancients and moderns, right? Is how they contextualized it. And at that point in my formation, it didn't really strike me as like, well, what's the difference? Right? Like, okay, the great books are like the dialogue of the ancients and moderns. And you can see that formation from Ave kind of imprinted into this article, right? That whole first part of the ancients is a building up for the most part. It's characterized by, reflecting upon this ordered whole, this cosmos, right? I think in the proper sense of the term. And then the second half, the moderns, are a deconstruction, right? Until we get to our age. And I remember, I can't remember exactly when, but I had gone to Ave, I'd gone through the Great Books program, and I was at a friend's house, and I ran into some people I went to high school with. And I didn't realize that they had gone to a liberal arts college. And I was like, oh, this is great. Like, I've read the great books, you've read the great books, like, et cetera. Yeah. And before I could really say anything that made me play my hand, they both came out as Marxists.
Oh my goodness.
And they were like, yeah, we read that. And it was just like, man, it just really struck us. Like, we read Plato and Aristotle, and just really how much like Marx was just like, he really got it.
Oh my goodness.
And it really struck me as like, oh, okay, so you have this, take like the great books that like, the Western world, this actually set series of these volumes. You take, this is what I kind of critique here, and that kind of gave me an insight into something that's grown over time, which is even these people who read the great books, and they read them like, we read the great books in a chronological order, we see this great conversation, etc. But like, if you have no guide, if you're just like taking them all on your face, I mean, it's not enough, I think, to actually dig into what's real. It's not enough to actually conform your mind to truth, because you see too often people read the great books and they come off with a wrong or incorrect opinion, right? Or they become, like I mentioned, a cosmopolitan relativist. And I think this one's more common, right? Is they're actually well read. They're like, well, I've read Rousseau, I've read Kant, like all these great men disagree. Like, who are you to pick one or the other? And really, like, no matter how much you read of these great men, you basically just evolve back into a relativist. You're just a somewhat well-read one, right? And that was really striking to me that like, and really started to push me to understand and appreciate certain things I had at Ave of, okay, it's not enough just to read these texts or even read them together, right? Something has to be guiding me or giving me some type of infrastructure by which I engage with them.
Is there forgive my ignorance on this, but if you have like the ancients versus the moderns, and there's this bell curve of the great books of those who are constructing versus those who can deconstruct. Is there who is the top of the bell curve of, okay, these guys are still constructing versus, okay, now we've gone to deconstruction? Is there any unanimous opinion on this, or is this highly...
I have my answers, but go, Aaron.
Well, it's funny. It's actually a very interesting point. Think about any aspect of our lives. We think of the church, and some people bemoan, what went on in the 60s and 70s, and they think, oh my goodness, so much, societal and ecclesial collapse, and indeed there was. But then people are like, well, it precedes the council, right? There was stuff already going on, stuff behind the scenes, stuff festering, like a wound. And then you go back further. It's like, well, maybe goes back to the First Vatican Council, and there was so much turmoil there regarding papal infallibility. Then you push it further. My point is there's always kind of a further point to which we can push it, almost indefinitely. Points that I would obviously point to, and I'm sure Deacon would point to these and maybe some others, are the Protestant Reformation and obviously the adoption of, William of Ockham and others, and voluntarism and nominalism and so forth, and we can talk about what those are. But also, in addition to the Reformation, the father of modern philosophy is considered to be René Descartes, and so you have him and the whole decline in the philosophical tradition with Descartes. But again, so many figures are at play, and so many different historical, cultural events are at play that it's hard to put a pin exactly where we want to go. But those are some benchmarks, and then you have inheritors of this tradition, this decline that really ramp things up. So you have Nietzsche, like you mentioned this article, I'm just going to totally get rid of the past, right? A clean break, right? Socrates and Jesus represent, the worst of us, as it were. And so I'm going to have this whole new project. And so you have some people who are more daring than others, some people who want to make friends with people in the tradition, but then kind of chart their own path. And then some who are just a clean break, and Nietzsche's among them, who's just bold and brave in the worst possible way.
Yeah. No, I agree with all that. I think that, just on an introductory level, if you're trying to make some demarcations, I think Martin Luther, the Reformation, right? Obviously, our Protestant brothers and sisters are going to probably have some slight disagreement with that. But I think if you start looking at when was the ordered whole really started to be deconstructed? When did we start to atomize things? When did we start to have a different understanding of freedom? When did we start to think that religion was malleable to us? There's a lot of things that he brings that I think then, a lot of people look at the Enlightenment as basically just a secular version of Protestantism, right? So Luther taught us, right, that religion is malleable to us. And if religion's malleable, then why not reason or history or my gender or anything else, right? Why is it, once God becomes malleable to us and to the human will, one thing I've learned is it's amazing now if you go back and you read people like Descartes, just as an example, you read that and you can be like, wow, that, today reading that, you can see the roots of this or that error, immediately, but that error won't pop up for another 500 years, right? So they kind of have this deconstruction, but it takes the culture a long time to soak in. So I think that people would look at Martin Luther. I think that when I was at Ave had some pretty heavy Straussian, Leo Strauss thinkers. He has a lot of commentary on the great books, to put it lightly. But obviously, he's going to push heavily into someone like Machiavelli, right? I think Machiavelli is another great signpost. And so you have the Luther, you have Machiavelli. I think those two are very fair assessments of when did modernity really start? When did we start to see the rejection? Obviously, there's cultural underpinnings before that because they're not pulling from nothing, right? There's things that lead that. And then I think I agree with Aaron that then if you push deeper into that, you get nominalism, you get William of Ockham, right? If you have, who's an incredibly difficult read, but you start to be he has his impact as well. And then honestly, all throughout the ancient, I think that you can demarcate it and say something definitively changed here and caused an effect that was taken up by culture. But I do think even in the ancient period, if you look and we say, oh, they're building up an ordered whole, that's absolutely true. But also in every age, you have detractors. You have people that were trying to tear things down.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, culturally, it didn't take a root, and we were allowed to continue to reflect on the cosmos. But then because of where the world was, when you get people like Machiavelli or Luther, that deconstruction took root and then started to play out.
I think it's important, too, to always step back, especially individuals who are concerned with wisdom and to be able to see the big picture. And, there have been wonderful intellects who have kind of traced for us, stepping back and seeing history as a whole and seeing that break. And so both Strauss and Benedict, as you mentioned in the article, in his Regensburg lecture, point to particular figures, right, as these benchmarks. So you can step back and see this narrative of this growing wisdom tradition, and then all of a sudden there's a definite break in these particular authors, both Machiavelli for Strauss and Luther for Benedict.
Yeah. And, I'm glad, Deacon seems to like this Regensburg lecture very much, and it's perfectly intelligible.
What did I call it? One of the most important post-conciliar documents? Yes.
Exactly. And I would agree. I remember, like you were saying, you kind of remember where you were and what you were doing. And, I kind of remember that with reading the Regensburg lecture. I mean, it was so impactful to me. And I thought, wow, I mean, he's really giving voice to not to what I've thought, but kind of what I experienced. I mean, I was not a convert. I grew up as a Catholic, but the relationship between faith and reason, and between nature and grace, for that matter, was so important to me, because I had a sense that as a Catholic, I didn't have to turn off my brain, as it were. And you can't take that for granted in the Protestant tradition. I mean, again, we love our Protestant friends, but at the same time, there's this deep current in Protestantism that pushes against human reason. And so you can see people like Tertullian saying, what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? And this kind of mentality exists even today. But as Catholics, we don't espouse that, right? Marriage between faith and reason is taken, hopefully by faithful Catholics, for granted and actually implemented in everyday study in life. And that to me was, I don't know if I would be Christian, if it weren't for that, because I had such a sense that I had to pursue the mysteries of faith through reason. And if the church had said, no, don't do that, either be a fideist or a rationalist, I would have been like, well, to heck with this. So anyway.
Yeah, it's an underpinning of the harmony of faith and reason.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I do think, maybe as an aside, but something that just it's somewhat implicit in the article, 3 recommendations for actually like where can I go to get a map of modernity? Like where could I go? That's obviously, don't read this 800-page text, but just like maybe a quick snapshot. One is the Regensburg Address by Pope Benedict XVI. It's amazing. It's focused on the Logos. It got a lot of bad press when it came out unfairly, but really it's a deconstruction of what happened to the West, right? And then how do we pick this up? And I think if you read it, you'll see that thought is really impactful in what I'm trying to do here in this article. The other one, Leo Strauss, right, the German Jewish philosopher, wrote heavily on the great books. Just wonderful commentaries. A lot of his stuff is available online for free. His lectures, stuff like that, what I've found incredibly insightful. He has one called The 3 Waves of Modernity, which is a short little article. And at Ave, they were always comparing Benedict XVI's Regensburg Address, because he gives us 3 stages of de-Hellenization, right? To de-logos ourselves, right? That we've rejected reason as moderns. We think about rejecting religion, we think about rejecting faith, but really actually we've rejected reason, right? He has that beautiful line, right? The radius of reason has shrunk, right? It's a wonderful line. They're always comparing Benedict XVI's Regensburg Address, 3 stages of de-Hellenization, with Leo Strauss's 3 waves of modernity, and where they saw, because that's not only just a map, but also like where are the movements, things like that. I think both those texts are amazing. They're both available online. The other one too, which might be an outlier, and I don't know, blame my Protestant background, but I actually think C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man is a really good snapshot as well. You're laughing, but I just think it's really good. I think it's particularly good though for those who the other 2 documents would choke out. because it's C.S. Lewis, so he has this reputation for being approachable. Also, he uses really practical examples. He starts off with like, a critique of a children's grammar book about how they talk about a waterfall, right? It's an incredibly approachable subject. Yeah. And then he doesn't want to talk about the logos because he knows that his audience, their eyes will glaze over if he starts, talking about Christianity. So to talk about an ordered whole of reality, he pulls from different cultures, but then as his term of art, he uses the Tao, right? Tao. Right, yes. And because of that, like I've been able to sit at coffee shops and talk about the abolition of man and what C.S. Lewis talks about there, about understanding that we live in an ordered whole, that things have a rational order, that we can discover that rational order, right? We can truly have a connection between our mind and reality. I've been able to talk at coffee shops with people with that who never would pick up Pope Benedict or anyone else. So I just, those are the three texts I think are good little snapshots.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's principally because of our education, a more philosophic or theological formation that we received at Ave Maria, that we could actually then approach the great books and understand this trajectory of texts. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, there's a great danger. I mean, if you read the moderns, they're very attractive.
Can be, yeah. Kant, not so much. Unless I don't know, maybe you're a big fan of Kant's writing style.
Yeah. Kant, he can be persuasive, in my opinion.
I mean, they kind of take on this kind of Milton, appealing force, and this negative force, where the rebellious hero, right? And so, by the fact that they're rejecting everything, it's very attractive to us moderns, right? Because we're very kind of juvenile in that kind of philosophical, intellectual.
Well, because we're downstream from them.
Yeah,
exactly.
We've been formed, intellectably, unwittingly by them. Another book that I actually used when I taught the deacons here in the diocese was Adler's 10 Philosophical Mistakes, and I thought I'd mention it because we mentioned Adler. And so that text is pretty good. I mean, he goes through, Hume and Kant and Locke and all kinds of other figures, Descartes, and trying to situate, like you said, why are we where we are? How did we get here? What are the philosophical underpinnings to our modern culture? And he does it in a pretty practical, simple way. He says, okay, what are the implications of viewing man as just a highly advanced animal? What does that lead to? And so I think the men, I don't want to speak for them, but I thought they found it pretty compelling because he is pretty good at breaking things down simply. And so, Adler is not perfect by any means. And the compilation that he and Hutchins make and others have made of the great books is obviously not perfect. But these figures are often not themselves committed to a kind of relativism. Adler certainly thought that there was truth to be had in someone like Aristotle and St. Thomas, and that these modern figures were distorting the truth. And so, again, these figures aren't perfect, but they often themselves were committed to, something you would probably approve of a little more than...
Yeah, I think one thing that stood out to me just as I was kind of doing the research of this, and I own the Great Books of the Western World series. I think it's actually a great text to pick up and buy, particularly as they're now editing books and stuff. Buy these old books, build your libraries up. I think it's an important thing to do. And no one else is going to give you that many of the great books together in chronological order, et cetera, than this series will, right? It's good. And yes, it has its ups and downs, and sometimes what translations they had to use to make it work and things like that. But yeah, I do think one thing that really stood out to me is look at this. The opening quote, right? We are concerned as anybody else at the headlong plunge into the abyss that Western civilization seems to be taking. He wrote that in 1952.
Very dramatic, yeah.
Most of us would push a button and be like, oh my gosh, can we go back to certain things? We need to restart, right? Not that I think 1950 is the goal. I don't want to get into that debate. But I just think a lot of times we look at 1950, or a lot of people do, as something that's like, oh, look, they had things together or whatever. And look, they're observing this in 1952. I think there's certain ways in which, not to be overly depressing, that if our forefathers could look into the future and see our age, we are the dystopia. Yeah. We are the hellhole that they were like, oh, that will never happen, or we got to stop that from happening, right? And so, just to read these guys that are trying, and so yeah, I agree. They're trying to do something. I think where some of the critiques come into them, and where I see this among other great books things like conservative thinkers, is that they kind of want to like, there's like a secret, right? Or they want to get you into reading the great books under the premise that if I can just get you to reading them, right? So there's no like, it's dialogue over truth. Like we're not trying to pursue a particular end or understanding. We just got to read this and we're going to dialogue together. And I think that, yes, do I think that, Mortimer's trying to make you a secret relativist? No, I actually think he's trying to do the opposite. Yeah. I think he thinks like if you'll read Plato and Aristotle, the truth will truly set you free, right? Like you'll unlock these things, etc. Mm-hmm. But the problem is I just don't know if that works. And actually I've seen it not work, right? Where then you get these great books, quote unquote programs. And really it is. The goal is just to be well-read and have dialogue. Mm-hmm. And you enter a relativist, you come out a relativist, you're just a well-read one. And so I just think that, because obviously we had to have our own discernment here on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, of like, do we do that? Do we just kind of start off talking about like Aristotle and Plato and Homer and we just lead into this? And then, at our reading schedule, whatever it will be, 10 years later, we finally get to Jesus Christ and we're like, by the way, we think this is the truth, right? Yeah. Like, or, what I elected to do, and I'm glad Adam has trusted me in it, is actually just to come out with a robust understanding of we're pursuing the Logos, and ultimately that is Jesus Christ, right? Reason itself, right? The ordering principle of all reality. And it's him that is the standard by which then we judge all these texts, and we take it historically that providence really did till the world for the reception of Jesus Christ in the incarnation. I mean, that is the historical event that we can use as our guidepost in trying to then look at all these other authors throughout history. Mm-hmm. And so I just think that sometimes when you come in somewhat limp-wristed on this, even if you have good intentions, it just doesn't work, particularly in our loud, noisy world. And also a lot of people jump around, right? They're not going to have, the discipline to be like, okay, we're going to start reading Homer. I mean, we are, right? We're going to have a year of Homer. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But like, I don't want to start reading Homer. I want to start reading, Nietzsche or whatever, because you talk about seductive modern writers. Like, personally, I think he's a wonderful rhetorician, right? He's peddling almost just evil, but, right, complete rejection of Christ and Socrates, right? Really a rejection of anything real besides the will. But his prose are amazing, right? They're wonderful to read. So why don't I just start reading the great books with Nietzsche, right? So it's hard for me to see, I'm happy for some pushback, but it's hard for me to see. Obviously, like on a pastoral level, if I was dealing with one person, I might make, some different recommendations, right? I might pastorally say, hey, why don't we just read this text together or that text together, whatever. But when you're trying to come up with these programs, you're inviting people to be educated through your sequence. It's just hard for me not to say, no, we do this in chronological order because you got to see the great conversation. And two, we've got to take Jesus Christ as our standard. And honestly, even if you're skeptical of that, even if you're like, well, I don't really understand what that means, I still don't understand what the Logos is, like that's fine. But historically speaking, as we look at these things building up for the incarnation, that's what we're going to look, right? Because we're going to track, kind of following Regensburg address, we're going to track not only the Greeks, we start with Homer, right? He's like the genesis of the Greeks. We track him, all the way into, say, Aristotle, and then you somewhat stop. And then you go back and you pick up the Hebrew tradition and you read with actual Genesis and you read the Old Testament, and then you see these two traditions converging, and then, under Roman order. So you have Hebrew faith, Greek reason, and then you have Roman order, and you see a world ready to receive Jesus Christ. And I think reading particularly those great books in that mindset is what starts to really uncover the truth, and it allows me as a Catholic to really look at Homer as a teacher, because it's not just Homer. Yeah. Like, I actually think that, and maybe just going out on a limb here, like, I think Providence used Homer to start to till the world, right? To start to cultivate in the Greeks a mindset that would be receptive to Jesus Christ, right? Is he a philosopher? Probably not. Is he saying stuff about the Logos? No. Is the Iliad full of people getting speared in the face and their eyeballs pierced out? Like these, yes, right? But at the end of the day, you start seeing these little whispers. You start seeing, like, how they talk about the gods. You start seeing, like, how are they starting to talk about virtue? How are they starting to look at the world? And you can see then by the time you get to Plato and Aristotle where these seeds have really started to be nurtured. And then obviously, then through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, reflecting on what is real, it really gives that Greek culture, that Hellenized culture, the receptivity it needs for then someone like St. John to say, I'm going to write my gospel in Greek. And I'm going to say the second person of the Blessed Trinity is the Logos.
Yeah.
And that's going to mean an incredible world of things to his Greek audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a absolutely packed word. So I really like here how you talk about, this Greek reason coupled with Hebrew faith under Roman order, because, I mean, this is not only just kind of tilling the intellectual soil, but even practically, it allowed for the unparalleled dissemination of thought, because you have the Pax Romana. And so, the apostles and others are able to go into these foreign lands and use the tools of reason and of faith to evangelize to the ends of the earth. I mean, obviously there remains work to be done even today, but if that's not a miracle, I actually don't know what is. And then the second thing I would mention is no matter what text we read, whether it's the newspaper or a book, a novel you're reading, or the Bible, you bring a philosophy and a metaphysic to it necessarily. Actually, Matthew Levering, we're talking about Ave Maria, so Matthew Levering, he's probably the most prolific theologian in the Anglophone world. He has a book, I think it's called Metaphysics in the Bible or something like that. And this is what he's talking about, how you bring necessarily a metaphysic, a way of seeing the world yourself and the world is related to God, even naturally, to the reading of the Bible necessarily. And so we have to know the real even before we approach the Bible. Now, granted, the Bible is going to give you insights and divine revelation about the world that God has created and about the world's God and creator. But nevertheless, you have to have some sort of foundation in the real before you approach any text. So I think that's a really important point. And it doesn't apply just to the great books. It applies to everything.
Yeah.
And that metaphysical key that Deacon was speaking of, right? Christ himself is obviously essential to not just reading these books and trying to discern, well, what is the meaning of these texts? Not only what is the intention of the author when he wrote these texts, but what is the more, the moral meaning of these texts or what have you? What is the author trying to say?
Yeah.
I mean, that's important, but there's a deeper meaning, right? What Joseph Pieper calls the philosophical act, right? You have to make a judgment on this. Is it true what Homer is saying about man's relationship to God, about virtue?
Yeah.
Right? There has to be a judgment, and of course, the standard of judging these texts, the validity or the viciousness of these texts, is based upon the teaching of Jesus Christ and His Church. So, that brings up a larger question, right? I mean, are the great books preparatory?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you need to be a believer prior to the engagement of these texts?
Yeah. And also then the fact that great books this is the problem, right, with that term, is that they're not monolithic, right? So we would say there's certain things that are like, that's why I like the Ave thing of ancients and moderns.
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at the ancients, I think, I would say that they cultivate the reception of the gospel. Right. And I think the reason this is a very simple, easy thing to state is simply because this is what they played in history. Right. So, the problem is we are so far removed from what is real. Just like, and this is one of the things about in that second section, right? Avoid the sins of your age. Mm-hmm. This is the problem, is that we aren't ancients, right? We're moderns. And so every presupposition of our culture tends to be antagonistic to not just the gospel, but to even understanding nature and the world being this ordered whole, right? That actually there's a beautiful ordering to the world and to reality. Everything against us, like everything in our culture, just tends to just press against us on that presupposition. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is that, I think as a modern, I don't want to adopt modernity or modernism as my thought, but I am a modern. I live in this age, and my brain's probably already been screwed up by looking at the screen on my phone, and some of the things I think about is like, you talked about this earlier, so let's talk about that, about just like the irony of this, and like, I just kind of, my kids now go to a classical school, and I'm desperately trying to give them things that I didn't find out until like my mid-20s. Mm-hmm. right? I mean, for me, it's all kinds of stuff because I had a long shot. But, like my daughter, she's, working through the Baltimore Catechism. She learns like the natural virtues, the cardinal virtues.
Nice.
And great, wonderful. And one of the things I've tried to show her, because it's kind of hard, they don't understand the treasure they have.
Yeah.
So I've tried to explain to her, I was like, do you realize Dad did not know what the cardinal virtues were probably till about halfway through undergraduate? Like that was not even part of my Christian tradition. But my Christian tradition had no presuppositions in nature.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't understand nature and grace, which I realize is like, your forte of understanding that relationship. That concept of them, any tethering there would not have made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the problems with the moderns is why I included this quote from The Art of Worldly Wisdom, which is a wonderful, wonderful text. It's just like 300 Spanish maxims on, kind of like Proverbs, but avoiding the sins of your age is because that's kind of how I feel right now is, our liberal arts are falling, right? They've really basically fallen apart outside of maybe some bastions, some entities like Ave are trying to figure out how to, fit them inside a 4-year degree or add a great book sequence. I mean, there are entities that I think are giving it a good faith effort, but really like looking at the age, looking at where our world's going, part of my impetus of reading the great books, and I think Adam jump in here, but part of it was I want to start to be familiar with these authors before my children get to an age in which they can start to read them, because I want to be familiar and be able to pass these on to my kids, and they will then be a world ahead of where I was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that is a good segue into like, what did Alcuin of York do? I mean, we talked about, you're the president of the Alcuin Institute, and we're talking about like we're so far removed from reality, from the real. We're trying to reestablish like this understanding of what the ancients did teach us, and build this foundation before our kids find out about it, so we can have a good conversation. This isn't new, possibly. Like Alcuin and Charlemagne realized this as well. Mm-hmm. And so what did they do? Because a lot of people I don't even think are familiar with Alcuin of York.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, he was very concerned with the education of his polis, right, of his people. And so he was really charged with the educational renewal of an entire generation, of entire people, which were suffering from an impoverishment of any type of formation whatsoever.
And what time period are we in?
So Alcuin was appointed, as kind of the educational overlord, if you will, of the known empire.
Great title.
Yeah.
In the year 800. So he had a very short span. I think from about 4 years he implemented his reforms. Obviously, it took a long time for these reforms to take place, but he did it in stages. Mm-hmm. And again, we can circle back to this because I think it's one of the critiques, if you will, or a critique that needs to be addressed with the great books movement in general. But the first thing he decided is that he needed to form the imaginations of his people. And so he basically had them engage with reality in a very robust and meaningful way. So he sent them out into the forest, into the fields, to be exposed to reality. He famously said that the forests of Europe need to be populated with boar and deer. Of course, he did that because he's a very practical thinker. Again, he was in charge of educational renewal, and so he realized that he needed the instruments of education. He needed the paper, the vellum, the deer skin, but he also needed the brushes in order to write, and so he needed the boar. But again, deeper meaning, deeper pedagogical reality is just the exposure to reality to form the imagination. After that, he had all the texts that had survived years of neglect to be painstakingly copied, letter by letter, word by word, and so a return to primary sources. And thirdly, he realized that he needed to build a group of educators. And so he brought the known educators into his palace, if you will, to be formed according to his method, and then he sent them out, forming these deep friendships, and sent them out throughout the world to begin educating others. So this is kind of the 3-stage approach to the renewal of formation. It's interesting, the great books movement is really emphasizing the second, a return to the ancient texts, to become conversant with it. But prior to that was the formation of the imagination, the exposure to reality. And this is what I'm just curious what you all think about. If we want individuals to begin to become conversant with the tradition through these great texts, through these great authors, through the literature and the beauty that is in the truth that is professed and expounded in these texts, do they first need to be exposed to reality? Is that the lack of exposure to reality a handicap, if you will, to reading the great texts?
Well, first off, I'd also like to mention that Blessed Alcuin of York was a deacon. I think that's an important part of his story.
Most important feature.
Yes,
of it.
so I knew you were about to say that, so I just didn't want to interrupt. So, yeah, I think that one thing that's occurred to me lately is, so the Alcuin Institute somewhat famously one time held a cultural event in which you butchered a sheep,
Correct.
right?
We butcher many
Also,
things.
Yeah.
pig.
Other
We've been
animals.
well. The lamb fits better with my defense. So you butchered a lamb right out your property. So you are a scholar, a man of Aquinas and Aristotle. You also have 8 wonderful children running around, and you have a little family farm that's got chickens, a cow, little baby lambs, baby doll lambs.
An awesome ram.
Yes, all kinds of farm beasts.
Just all kinds of stuff. So very much a real, right? You've got that going on. So, one of the things that occurred to me recently is, when you went and had that event that we give you flack over, but it was actually really good, where you slaughtered the lamb. Some of the people that I was teaching in RCIA went to that event, and they came back, and I was like, "Oh, how was it?" Et cetera, because I really didn't know how they were going to take it, right? And all they could talk about is how many of the scriptures now made more sense to them, right? Like Christ being silent like a lamb, right? Being silent like a lamb before the slaughter, all the sacrifice text within the Old Testament, like all these things, obviously the lamb imagery in Revelations, like all this imagery that scripture uses that actually would have been incredibly commonplace to people, at the time the author was writing, which is now incredibly alien to us because we think food comes from the grocery store. To them, it just opened up their eyes. And I think it's what you're talking about is that we're so far removed from what is real, right? Like, where's our food come from? Or like, when's the last time you touched grass or went outside or stopped staring at your screen? That even some of the basic analogies in scripture or used by Homer or any of these things don't carry the same weight, or we just don't really know what they're talking about. And even, not that I want to derail onto this, but even like today, like what is a father? What's a man? What's a woman? So if you say God is father, but you have no rational understanding or touch point on what a father is, or what a father does for a family, or that love, or that discipline, et cetera, like how then do you understand Scripture saying that God is like a father, or God is our father, right? Or St. Paul, like all of our fathers are named after the Father, right? So no, I think it impedes our ability. So talk more about this, because I think then you have subtly tried to do this with the Alcuin Institute, in which, like, before you even have the great texts that are supposed to tutor us in what is real, you've had, what would you call it, like a true poetics, like this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So the kind of the philosophical principle behind this is that wisdom is born out of or flows from wonder, right? Obviously, the scripture attests to this reality as well. So you need to be formed in wonder before you can grow in wisdom. Again, Aristotle mentions this, that all knowledge, not just some, all knowledge originates in the senses. So we need to be formed. Our senses need to be formed. Again, a liberal arts education traditionally included not just the formation in the trivium and the quadrivium, as you mentioned, but also prior to that, you had the gymnasium, and you had the formation in music, right? So you have to form the senses first, then form the internal senses, the emotions, before you can then begin to form the intellect and the will. So there's a pedagogy, there's an intentional movement, if you will, of formation that all great classical education followed. And the danger with the great book sequencing, independent of the whole, is that you lose sight and you emphasize solely that the intellect and the will, and not emphasize the formation in the senses and the emotions. So the whole point of what the Alcuin Institute is realizing this ancient integrated formation and saying, yes, of course we need to be formed, our intellects need to be formed, and we need to have recourse and understand the great texts and the large narrative and enter into that narrative, but also we need to form our senses, right? We are bodily creatures. And so our body needs to be formed prior to our intellects or our souls being formed. And again, we're moderns, as you mentioned, right? And we have this Cartesian or Gnostic understanding of the human person where we overemphasize the intellect over and against the body. And so the whole man needs to be formed to be transformed into an alter Christ.
This is actually, something that the kind of moderate realism that someone like Aristotle espouses and promotes is so powerful. So at the beginning of the beginning of the Ethics, rather, he says, all men all men naturally desire to know. And he says the proof of this is the delight we take in our senses. So again, you might actually think that he's equivocating because he says all men desire to know. Well, is he referring to intellectual knowledge or to sense knowledge? Well, it's not really clear, but he says the proof of this is the delight we take in our senses, and then he proceeds to talk about intellectual knowledge. And so for a moderate realist like Aristotle, yes, it's precisely through the senses that we come into contact with the real, but then we don't just stay with the sense data, right? We abstract and actually come to some sort of immaterial intellectual knowledge of the thing. And so for Aristotle, the physical bears something that is far more profound. I mean, this is what he does, going from the Platonic forms or ideas, right, and actually grounds things and things we can touch, feel, see, etc. That's a beautiful way to see the world, and that's something that someone like St. Thomas and the whole Christian tradition takes up as being conducive, as you said, Deacon and Richard, to an understanding and articulation of the gospel. So we're foolish if we think that every philosophy, every metaphysic is equally up to the task of bearing the profundity of the Christian faith. They're just not. That's not to be, uppity or to be arrogant. It's just to state that there's truth and there's falsity. And so the preambles of faith, the propaedeutics for the faith, have to be true things about the world and about us and about God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to set aside my desire to give a defense of Plato, but that's fine.
Fair enough. Fine. I love Plato,
no,
but
it's okay. I do think, Richard, you said several good points. I do think, where do we touch in with the real? How does that help us then at reading the great books? How do the great books then actually can help kind of tutor us in what is real? I do agree with you that the great books are not a replacement for the liberal arts. Right, but then the question is practically speaking, what is it that I do? Right, so I'm a man, I'm a father, maybe I'm a mother. But I come to realize that my education is lacking. Right, that I have this great privation, that my college degree didn't really teach me anything. It might have trained me how to be something, but it really didn't teach me how to think. And we're not going to jump into some, I think, shallow, let's teach critical thinking skills, right? But an actual formation of me as a human. Where was my human formation? And I start to understand these things. I start to find myself to be lacking. I think, all of us probably at some point have had this awakening. I know I did as I went through this, oh my gosh, I know nothing, right? I thought I was smart. I'm not. I don't know anything. Well, I can't go back to a 4-year college. I can't, do this. I can't. So I think the great books then, why do I read them? Why do I promote them? Is because I think that, for those, who have a family or doing these things, this is your best option, right? We can't go back and recultivate a full liberal arts education, but we can start reading these texts and we can read them in a more robust, full way that I think contextualizes them properly as these kind of tutors throughout history. I think one thing that I've realized that might distinguish what we're trying to do from other places in a real sense is really looking at particularly the ancients as the teachers, right? So if I'm reading a text or we're going to have this year of Homer, I'm not the teacher of Homer, I'm not the intermediary between Homer and the audience, but rather Homer's the teacher and you're coming together to learn alongside your other students, and some of those students, might be more familiar than others. But I think there's honestly a true humility to try and learn from Homer as a teacher, right? Obviously, same thing with Scripture, except obviously they're categorically different because Scripture is, inspired by God. But still having that humility, because I don't think we're taught to even read Scripture with humility, right? We're kind of taught to read Scripture in a very critical, historical way. And I think that's one thing that like really has tried to help me is come to a text not trying to critique it or but like, okay, I'm open. What is trying to be taught to me right now? And I think that that's a learning that you can do. You can wake up early. You can try and sacrifice an hour of Netflix at night to wake up at 5 or wake up at 6. Do your prayers, pour a cup of coffee, and just read for 45 minutes. Or just read for 30 minutes. If you just read 30 minutes a day, right, that can change your life, right? Particularly if you're on a good reading schedule. So like, as we're kind of entering into the year of Homer, some people will be able to read along with us, like as we kind of move from one book or one chapter a week, but some won't, right? And that's some of the feedback we've already received. And so like, each episode opens up with like a summary of the narrative. So even if like your life right now is crazy and you said, I can't start this, you could follow along. You could listen to the podcast and hopefully, God willing, at some point you can read it and then you can go back and you can listen again, or you'll already have a familiarity with it. And so I think there's like a way of like, if you look at, not that I'm an example on this, but just like kind of look at my own journey, I realize like my education is deprived in my 20s. I've already gone through like all of this education in my life. And then I start doing the great books. And then, after I got through of Ave, and then I went to law school, and then I started working for the diocese, I put myself on my own great books reading list. I was like, no, there was something here. I really need to go back. Right. And like we read, I read Plato's Republic for almost a full year. And then I turned right around and invited people to read it with me, hosted a small group at my house, which was where, you and I started to connect, and then turned around and read it over 10 months with a group of men at my house, right? And built that to say, like, there's something here we're spending time. There's something here worth kind of cultivating friendships over. So anyway, yeah, I just, you have to put the great books in context, and that term is used a lot of different ways. But I think in the way that we want to use it is like there really is an invitation here, a lifeline, right, to hold on to come in and actually learn what is real. And one thing I was thinking about is I just read, in anticipation of working through Homer, I just read Hesiod's Theogony, where he's in the 700s after Homer. He basically gives this giant genealogy of where the gods come from.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's not exactly always the most...
I read that on Saturdays, typically.
It's sometimes disturbing, right? I mean, it's
oh, yeah. Well, Zeus is just generally disturbing.
Yeah.
Just in general. He has some insatiable appetites. But one of the things I noticed that I thought you would like, Richard, when I started off is that, Hesiod, like how they always present themselves, he's just like, I'm just a shepherd. Right, I'm just out in the field and I'm just taking care of my sheep. I'm amongst the real, right? I'm focusing on just these practicalities, this basic labora, and all of a sudden the muses come down, right? And where we get so the 9 muses come down, and by Hesiod's point, they're actually naming them all, and they inspire him, and through him comes this like beautiful poetics, right? But that's what he is. He's just a shepherd. Right, he's just taking care of his, flock. So, as an owner of sheep, I don't know if you view yourself as a shepherd, but I thought you would like that.
That's great. I think, I mean, I agree with everything you were saying about the importance of the great books and actually sitting down and disciplining yourself to read through them. My the critique, of course, is realizing that as moderns, that our capacity to even sit and read has become greatly diminished. Right. That's just a reality of our technological age, for many factors. But again, having recourse to nature first, right, I think forms our capacity to read well. Because if one thing, practically speaking, it just allows us to sit and perceive. Right? Those who are shepherding or who are farming have to be kind of keen observers of nature. Right? You have to have a contemplative gaze upon reality, that first book of Revelation. And once you'll be able to actually sit and leisurely enjoy a sunset, preferably with a scotch and cigar in hand or what have you, you're then...
I like that more than the sheep option.
I'll take that one.
Right.
I want option 2.
Know when your sheep are in heat and so forth. All kinds of practical things you need to know as a shepherd. But again, it's forming your eye, if you will, to see. And again, that capacity to see is necessary in order to read the text and to read the text well.
What are some just practical Because what I don't want is like, great, someone's made it to like the second episode of the podcast and they've built up the courage, like, okay, I'm going to read Homer. They're looking at a fairly thick book, right, the Iliad.
Yeah.
And at some points can be very difficult, and it's like all these different names, and they're kind of on the cusp and like, okay, I can do this. I'm going to read it, or I'm going to read it with a group, whatever. And now they're listening to us, and they're like, great, now I also have to go buy sheep because if I don't understand how sheep work, then I can't understand Homer. So like, but I understand your point, which I agree with. What is just like some practical ways that if someone's like, okay, I understand that things around me are too artificial, but I live like in an apartment complex, or I do that. Like, what is it that I can do maybe to start embracing the real, or actually getting back to those like poetics into nature?
Well, I mean, I think what you said, even your own narrative, I think supports this. Namely, you read a text and you just kind of read it. So I think there's a poetic way, quote unquote, to read the great books as your first read.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's essential, right? You're not reading it, you're not analyzing it, you're not dissecting it, but you're just reading it for the enjoyment of reading it. And you may not understand any of it, but you're just reading it for the sake of reading it.
A true leisure.
Yeah, very good. I think that first read, and that's what you did with your own introduction, or maybe not your introduction, but your exposure to some of these texts. You read them once, you get the gist of the narrative, and then you go back with friends, you have a conversation about it, you try to understand it in a deeper and more profound way. So I think just the commitment to read a text and to be disciplined about that, and there's a poetic way I think you can engage the text that kind of begins to train your eye.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Do you have any?
I do. So you mentioned a kind of docility when reading a text, and I think that's key. So, docility doesn't mean that we become so open-minded, as I think Chesterton said, that our brain falls out. Not that kind of thing. But you're being docile, which is just a capacity for being taught. You're being docile not to any given author as such. So not, a Hesiod or Homer as Hesiod or Homer, but you're being docile to the truth. And as you said, if these people are being good shepherds, good communicators of the truth, they're vessels in a certain respect, which is what happens when the muses come down. I mean, they're possessed. Not
right.
in the negative way, in the positive way, right? They're so enraptured and possessed by the truth that they're pure vessels of its transmission. And so that's what being docile means, is being open to the truth and ultimately to the truth that is God. And so I think that's very vital. Now, I live in an apartment, so I don't have, you mentioned that.
You don't even have sheep?
I don't have sheep. I don't even have
Aaron.
a rabbit. I don't have any rabbit.
I went out and bought some rabbits because this podcast told me I had to have the real.
I have 3 guinea pigs.
Yeah. Rabbits are cute, but if you buy a rabbit, all you find out is that they poop a lot and reproduce often. So anyway,
The real.
But here's the thing. Nevertheless, and this is quite hypocritical of me to say, my wife would make fun of me, but nevertheless, putting down your phone or any kind of technology, engaging the persons with whom you share life, that could be a wife or a friend if you have a roommate or something like that, engaging with them, having meaningful conversations with them, going to the park with them, right? Engaging with the real in that way, and training yourself, as Dr. Meloche was saying, to kind of slow down and contemplate things as they happen, because we want to go to the next reel, on Instagram or something, and those are, maybe 5 seconds. And so we're very schizophrenic in the way we approach anything. And I do the same thing. I read an article and I get bored and I go to the next one, right? And in fact, I read articles in part because they're so short, so I can just finish it and say, have some sort of sense of accomplishment. But the great books don't allow you that luxury. And so they do require leisure. And so, it's going to require a certain moral cultivation as well. And so you mentioned, Deacon, the language of tutelage or of paideia, which you mentioned in here, which in the ancient world wasn't just, going and learning math or something like that. But in addition to learning the things that would make you better intellectually, actually moral formation. And so this is the interaction between the moral and intellectual virtues. You have to have both. And so that does not mean, except for maybe Adam, that we're perfect at this table, that we're, morally upright or something like that.
You realize Adam was the first to fall.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. You suck. I forgot about that. But it does mean that as you're approaching these texts, the virtue of docility is not going to come to those who are habitually, subjecting themselves to vices of turning in on yourself, of pride and selfishness and self-centeredness. Like, you have to be open to reality and to reality's God, right? To reality itself. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, just think things like staying away from your screens. I think the phones, and again, I should not be throwing stones here, but
Yeah, I mean,
it does rewire your brain. You want to read the great books, but then you train your brain that you can't focus on anything for more than 5 seconds. It's not going to work. A long time ago, I removed a lot of the social media apps from my phone. I kept the accounts for certain reasons, but I have to be at an actual computer. And I realized that like a lot of my usage of them just tanked. Right, Instagram was one that I just found like I just got to get rid of this. Like I have nothing.
I don't even.
I have lied.
It, so.
I have lied to myself that Twitter is worth it.
Yeah.
Right, because I'm like, oh look, I make these friends and relationships, and I learn things. So I've kind of lied to myself about Twitter. But I put social media limits on my phone, right? That come up and warn me, like, hey, you've been on for this long, like whatever. Reading aloud, like actually getting a book, reading it and reading aloud have actually found to be very fruitful. Particularly if
the
you're
more
read,
senses, the better, right?
Right. Particularly if you're going to read like something like the Iliad, right? Like trying to read these things out loud. The names can throw you for a loop. I understand that. But just like you understand the cadence, like sitting down with something real in your hands. Don't buy a Kindle. Don't buy those things. Don't replace one screen with another. Buy a real book that you can mark in, that you can own. We jokingly talk about touching grass, but yeah, I just go for a walk. Even if you live in an apartment complex, just like go for a walk. Like, can I sit here and look at, Instagram for another 30 minutes, or could I just go for a walk and be outside? Right. I think that there's just little things that I think you can cultivate to start to reclaim your life from things that are artificial.
Yeah.
We talked about, family dinners. If you have a family, right? If you have this, or like, I guess if you're living with like roommates or whatever, just like actually spending the time to prepare a meal,
Yeah.
right, is there, right? And yeah, you could listen to a podcast or something like that. You could listen to this podcast, but like, doing these kind of tactile things, I think really helps to reclaim your mind from the world that's artificial. And for us, I think as we work through the great books, these two things are not competitive, but they also shouldn't be isolated from one another, right? This should be part of a more holistic approach to kind of reclaiming your life. Because as we kind of, end, like one of the things that I ended the article with was that, modernity is a rejection, right? I mean, I think that we live in an age of the anti-logos, right? That everyone now is a god. Everything about you, yourself, right? You talked about Descartes, right? We've really kind of fully embraced Descartes, I think, in a lot of ways. The real you is some intellectual soul, whatever you want to call it, and everything else, your body, everything is just malleable to that, right? And not only, this is where the dictatorship of relativism comes in, not only can they be relativists about themselves and the world around them, or et cetera, but now we have to adhere to these relativistic fantasies. And then everything around us, right? All of our media, all of our screens, literally everything is designed to move our mind in adherence to these things. And I think just like shutting off the screens, doing these things, picking up a great book, and kind of learning like, okay, how did my ancestors, how did my forefathers, how did the saints before us come to cultivate a relationship with what is real and ultimately with God, right? How did they do that? So,
And then that's important too, because when you say anti-logos, people might think, oh, you mean, our culture is just anti-God because, so many people now don't believe in God and so forth. But no, when you're saying anti-logos, I mean, logos is the highest principle in the human person. And so to say that we're anti-logos means we're anti-human. We're anti the very thing that makes us most what we are. You know what I mean? So it's as much a violation against human persons as it is against divine persons. I mean, it's just destructive all the way down, as it were.
We don't want to fall into the trap as well as thinking that having any kind of intentionality in regards to the reading of the great books is we're doing it because of a conscience duty-bound ethic.
Yeah.
Right? I'm doing it because I said I'm going to do it. But ultimately, to both your points, is that by forming ourselves to reality, we ourselves are becoming more humane. We're perfecting ourselves as human persons, and that is a joy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a deep, satisfying pleasure and conforming our intellects to the real and to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, there's a delight in doing good, right? But it starts with those habits. It starts with reclaiming your life. It starts with picking up great texts. It starts with, both prohibiting certain things and then grasping on other things. And it's very hard to do. I think it's also very hard to do by yourself. I think that was one of the an impetus behind us starting this podcast was, whether it's on Twitter or, Adam already has the Catholic Man Show, like how many times people would reach out to one of us and you can tell that, they're asking questions where, but honestly, whether explicitly or implicitly behind it, you can tell that they are alone. They don't have friends.
Yeah.
They don't have this. So even if they're trying to understand, like,
at least
okay,
not friends that they can discuss meaningful
Right.
things with, and then you wonder
Right.
if they're really friends at all.
yeah, not anyone that would be friends like in a thick sense, right? Like in
Yeah.
a true sense of like, people that I can live life together, right?
Yeah.
I may be able to play a video game together with them, or I work with them, or we do something like that. But like that's one of the reasons I think behind us starting this endeavor. And we have, and you guys have been over it at any point in time. We have a Sunday Great Books that I host at my home, inviting men into the home and having good food and stuff. Things that Alcuin Institute does very well, and kind of hosting and getting this iron sharpens iron and getting these men together. Half the men have read the Iliad before, half of them haven't, and most of those men are there because they've realized their education was not a true education. They're not wholly formed, and they're trying to read these books because their kids are 6, 7, and 8. Right, and the first book they're going to read when they hit high school is the Iliad, right? And so, but
Hopefully.
Well, the way I look at it is like
Maybe not.
I have, I've gone through a certain journey in my own maturation, and now, like, because I realize where I am in my own formation, there's a certain way I can salvage where I am intellectually, but now I have been charged by Providence with the formation of my children. And I can now help them hopefully get a much better start on this than I did, right? Going to a classical school, having a home, right? Because they don't know these things. You put the screen in front of them, you just hand them an iPad, they become little iPad blobs because they don't know. They don't have any discipline. And so then certain things don't come into our house, right? Or we don't have a TV in our living room. We don't, it's like, yeah, we can have movie night because we got a screen somewhere in the, the bedroom that we can all crawl in bed maybe and watch a Sunday movie. But it's amazing to me how much you don't watch it if it's not like in the living. It's not something that's easily accessible. And so I'm hopeful, like nothing's perfect, right? That then like I can take what I've learned from the great books, obviously from, my formation as a deacon and my pursuit of Jesus Christ, and hand that on then to my children, who then can hopefully save the culture or do something. I don't know what's going to happen when they're adults, but that's like a lot of
Suffer well.
Be martyred.
yes,
Yeah,
probably just be martyred, but they will be martyred well. And so, yeah. So that's like a lot of like my own personal thought process of coming to this like podcast, but also coming to this article, and why I wanted to challenge myself too on how do we do this well.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I was just going to say, for those who think, that maybe we're being unduly negative or something like that, or just want to just trash modernity, in a joking way, there's a sense in which that's true. But again, we're trying to open people up to the wider reception of the intellectual tradition that we have unfortunately been deprived of for far too long. So, when I first was introduced to these things, I was actually quite angry because I felt as though that I had been, like there was a great inheritance. There was all this money and all this stuff, all this property that I was supposed to inherit, and I didn't. Instead, I inherited a trash can or something like that, And so it should inspire a certain amount of just anger in you as you realize what you've been deprived of. And so we're trying to point to the fact that this is really going to help people and to help us and to help you. And so again, not meant to be kind of too negative, but really the overall message is quite positive, namely that in this kind of thing done well, you can find flourishing and happiness and joy.
Right. You can ascend.
You can ascend.
You can ascend, right?
go.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's a good pushback, because I do think we have to be, it's easy to point out the negative, and a lot of times you have to
Mr.
point out,
Optimistic over here.
right, you have to point out the negative. Well, I am an attorney, so the negative comes very natural to me, right? But you have to point out the negative sometimes to wake people up, right? This is not real. Like, look
Yes.
around you, right? The things are not going well. And I think that actually the more that is actually becoming somewhat mainstream in our culture, like, that people are realizing, wait, something's terribly wrong.
Yeah.
Then people are looking for answers. And then I think like, hey, here's one that's not based off anger or pushing back or responding, with a vice or any things.
Yeah.
Here's one that actually is like calling us to what's true, good, and beautiful. Here's what will actually, as you mentioned, right, actually help you form you as an excellent human that will teach you how to delight in virtue and actually have a virtuous life, which the point of is happiness, right? To be happy. So
Exactly.
Adam,
Gentlemen, thank you so much for hanging out with us this evening. It's been a lot of fun.
It was a blast.
Thank
It's
you.
always great to get together and talk about such things.
Yep, Dr. Richard Meloche and Dr. Aaron Henderson of the Alcuin Institute for Catholic Culture for the Diocese of Tulsa.
Thank you
Thank
both.
you guys so much.
Thank you.